The ground beneath your feet is not as stable as you believe. Beneath the cities, mountains, and deep oceans lies a majestic and terrifying power. A sea of molten iron, swirling at temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. This liquid engine generates Earth's magnetic shield, an invisible barrier that protects all life from the lethal radiation of space. But on January 14, 2026, the engine stalled. It started with the deep silence. At subterranean listening posts, ultra-low frequency sensors suddenly went flat. The massive molten currents in the outer core, a river of liquid fire, began to decelerate at an impossible rate. It wasn't natural cooling. It was as if Earth's kinetic energy was being siphoned away by an unseen force. Within hours, the core glitch hit the surface. In London, gravity began to fluctuate. People felt a sickening weightlessness, followed by crushing pressure as the planet's internal balance shifted. Compasses didn't just point the wrong way. They began to spin uncontrollably, their needles sparking with static energy. Dr. Eris Thorne's team discovered a reality that defies every law of geology. The liquid iron is crystallizing. It's a process called rapid core freezing. Thousands of miles beneath us, a forest of jagged black iron crystals is growing. Growing at 10 miles per second, turning our planet's liquid heart into a solid, silent stone. But why? The Earth's internal heat should last for billions of years. That's when the ghost auroras appeared. Massive, silent curtains of white light began to rise out of the ground in the middle of our streets. These aren't the lights of the north. They are streams of pure thermal energy being pulled upward from the core. Something is draining the Earth's life force from the inside out. We are no longer living on a self-sustaining world. We are living on a cooling sphere being converted into something cold, dark, and mechanical. The countdown to the final freeze has begun. By the second day of the stalling, the world as we knew it had begun to dissolve into a terrifying new reality. Without the constant churning motion of molten iron deep below, the Earth's magnetosphere began to tear apart like a veil in a storm. In the skies over the equator, the midday sun took on a haunting violet hue. Satellites, stripped of magnetic protection, began to short-circuit and burn out in the upper atmosphere. They fell back to Earth in a rain of glowing debris, streaks of gold and silicon lighting up the daytime sky. But the real horror was not happening above us, it was happening beneath our feet. Deep crust sensors planted miles into the mantle sent back the final data of the inner world. The liquid iron wasn't just freezing in a random pattern, it was being sculpted into something geometric. The rapid core freezing was creating massive crystalline towers of iron nickel, stretching hundreds of miles high into dark depths. It did not look like a natural geological event. To observers in command centers, it looked like the birth of a city, a dark, metallic metropolis growing in the crushing pressure of the Earth's center. The core was no longer a heart. On the surface, the ghost auroras were no longer silent. They began to emit a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the bones. A sound like a billion tuning forks struck at once. This frequency began to interfere with the very fabric of human perception. People began to report seeing the golden web, a shimmering grid of magnetic lines appearing in the air, glowing like threads of light. Panic was replaced by a strange, hollowed-out silence. The Earth's rotational speed began to skip. Days became minutes shorter, then shifted again. The moon, sensing the sudden change in the Earth's internal mass, began to exert a different gravitational pull, triggering tectonic plates that had been dormant for 1,000,000 years. The oceans began to retreat from the coastlines, as if the Earth was holding its breath. As the first mountain-sized iron crystal breached the ocean floor in the middle of the Atlantic, a new truth became clear. The Earth's liquid heart was gone. In its place sat a solid-state processor the size of a planet. And then, the first pulse was sent. A beam of pure, focused energy shot out from the North Pole, piercing through the atmosphere, and aimed directly at the center of the galaxy. We weren't just a planet anymore, we had been turned into a lighthouse. And the signal was calling something home. The moment the North Pole pulse fired into the stars, the Earth's thermal balance collapsed. The core was no longer providing the heat that had kept our planet alive for eons. The great cooling had moved from the center of the world to the very air we breathe. Across the globe, the temperature began to drop at a rate of 10 degrees per hour. In the tropical regions, where winter was a myth, snow began to fall over the rainforests, turning the vibrant green canopies into white frozen graveyards. The oceans, Once the great regulators of our climate began to grow still, without the magnetic churn of the core, the deep-sea currents stopped moving. The blue heart of the world was turning to ice. But the cold was not the most terrifying change, it was the sky. As the lighthouse pulse continued to beam energy into deep space, the atmosphere began to thin. The sky, which had once been a brilliant blue, transitioned into a permanent bruised purple, then finally into a void-like black. Even at noon, the sun looked like a distant cold coin, stripped of its warmth by the failing gases of our world. We were losing our blanket. In the cities, humanity retreated into the deep sheds, massive underground bunkers built into the subways and sewers, huddling around the last remaining electrical heaters. But even there, the sound followed us. The lighthouse frequency was no longer a hum. It had become a rhythmic digital script that echoed through the crust every 11 minutes. It was the sound of data transmission. Our planet was no longer hosting life, it was uploading a history. High above the freezing clouds, the golden web, that shimmering magnetic grid, had become so dense it was visible from the ground, as a solid cage of light. We watched through frost-covered windows as the grid began to pulse in sync with the signal. We realized then that the energy wasn't just being sent out, it was being received. The stars began to move. Not the slow, ancient drift of the constellations, but a coordinated geometric shift. Thousands of lights, previously hidden by the glare of the sun, were descending toward the Earth's orbit. They weren't coming to save us from the cold. They were coming to collect the hard drive that our planet had become. The final night had arrived, and as the last of the surface water froze into a solid sheet of glass, we saw the first shadow cross the face of the moon. The harvesters were no longer a theory, they were here for the data. The shadow that crossed the moon was only the beginning. As the Earth's atmosphere grew thin and brittle with the extreme cold, the sky finally tore open. These were not ships in the way we understood them. They did not burn fuel or leave trails of fire. They were massive, silent monoliths of obsidian and chrome, descending through the frozen clouds like needles piercing the skin of the world. The harvesters had arrived. They did not land in our cities. They did not demand surrender. To them, we were nothing more than the biological residue on a massive hard drive. Their focus was entirely on the golden web, the magnetic grid that now encased the Earth. As the monoliths hovered over the planetary poles, they began to project beams of negative light, a spectrum of color that the human eye was never meant to see. Under the influence of these beams, the iron crystal forest at the Earth's core began to vibrate. The energy was so intense that the ground itself began to glow with a translucent, milky light. In the frozen bunkers below, people watched in terror as the very walls of the Earth became see-through. We were looking through the crust, down into the heart of a machine we had lived on for 1,000,000 years. The lighthouse signal changed. The rhythmic chirping was replaced by a continuous screaming tone that shattered glass and vibrated through the teeth of every survivor. This was the download. Every memory ever recorded in the magnetic field of the planet, every war, every discovery, every heartbeat, was being pulled out of the Earth and into the obsidian monoliths. The Earth's rotation began to stutter and jerk. The massive weight of the crystalline core was being manipulated from above, shifting the planet's center of gravity. As the data flowed upward, the planet itself began to shrink. The cooling was causing the crust to buckle and fold, creating massive new mountain ranges of jagged ice and rock in seconds. We realized then the true nature of our existence. Earth was not a home, it was a farm. A biological computer designed to run for eons until its data was ripe for the taking. And now the harvest was nearing its end. As the monoliths began to glow with the stolen light of our world's history, the moon, the silent observer, began to move closer. It was coming to act as the final lock in the system. The stars above were no longer distant. The sky was filled with the metallic hull of a craft so large it blotted out the entire horizon. The collector had arrived for the drive, and we were still inside. As the obsidian monoliths completed the download, the world went silent. The screaming frequency that had shattered our windows and vibrated our bones vanished, replaced by a stillness so absolute it felt like the end of time itself. The golden web, the magnetic cage that had held our history, began to dissolve. The threads of light didn't just fade, they were pulled upward, vanishing into the bellies of the great ships. And then the Earth did something impossible. It groaned. A massive seismic wave, the largest in recorded history, rippled through the crust. But it wasn't a tectonic shift, it was a release. With the data harvested and the core solidified, the harvesters no longer needed the planet to remain in its current state. The monoliths fired a final golden beam directly into the North Pole, not to take but to give. They were triggering the reset. The solid iron forest at the center of the Earth began to vibrate with such intensity that the heat returned in an instant. But it wasn't the slow, natural warmth of a living planet. It was a thermal explosion. The ice that had covered the world for weeks turned to steam in seconds, creating a global fog so thick it hid the stars. Through the mist, we saw the monoliths rise. They moved with a terrifying grace, ascending toward the massive craft that blotted out the sun. As they departed, the moon, our hollow guardian, began to move back to its original orbit, its task of stabilization complete for another cycle. The ghost auroras flickered one last time and died. The magnetic field stabilized, the engine of the world restarted, and the sun broke through the fog. To a casual observer, it looked like a miracle. The air was warm again, the sky was blue. The oceans began to flow. But we who remained in the deep sheds knew the truth. We looked at each other and realized something had changed. Our memories, our deepest personal thoughts, our history, our very identities, felt thin, transparent. The harvesters hadn't just taken the planet's data, they had taken ours. The Earth had been wiped clean. A fresh hard drive, formatted and ready for a new era of biological input. We are the remnants of a previous version, glitches in a system that has already moved on. As we climbed out of the bunkers into the new warm morning, we looked up at the empty sky. The harvesters were gone, carrying the sum of human existence to a destination we will never see. We are starting over, not as masters of the world, but as the opening lines of a new chapter we won't live to read. The skywall is gone, the moon is silent, the core is spinning, but the Earth is no longer ours. It is simply waiting for the next harvest.